Introduction. The test of English as a foreign language exam, or TOEFL, is a popular English test typically used for non-native English-speaking senior high students preparing to enter college in the US. As an English teacher myself, I am extremely familiar with both the TOEFL and the official materials used to teach it. Over the years, I have also come across training material for TOEFL which is of a much lower quality, but which is widely used by students because it is cheap. The content I'm examining in this video is an example of this lower quality content in an English textbook called TOEFL Junior 10 Practice Tests, published in 2015. It should be noted that this book was produced in China, published in Beijing, and has not been approved by the Educational Testing Service, the official organization which writes and administers the TOEFL test and which oversees the content of approved training material. However, this book is part of a series which is used widely in Asia, especially in Vietnam, China, and Taiwan, and is advertised specifically as having been, quote, written by two specialist and qualified teachers who are highly experienced in training learners for TOEFL Junior tests, end quote. Consequently, it has been used to teach tens of thousands of students, perhaps hundreds of thousands of students, for years. Material from this book and others in the series can also be found on many Chinese language English teaching websites, so it's potentially reaching millions of people each year. I'll show the content in sections, commenting on it as I do so. Since I'm using so little of the overall book content, and since I've already made the decision to keep my channel unmonetized, I'm well covered by relevant fair use legislation, especially since my own content using this material is both critical and transformative. This video examines a particular article in the book covering these topics. 1. US Iraq and Afghanistan war propaganda. 2. How did US soldiers respond to these letters? Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. US Iraq and Afghanistan war propaganda. The content I'm examining in this book is in the form of a reading article for students. Here's the first section. Quote, some soldiers who have been serving in Iraq and Afghanistan recently made special stops at schools around the United States. They stopped by to share their experiences and to thank students for letters and packages they sent. End quote. So now we know the topic of this article. It's about soldiers in the US Army visiting schools around the nation and thanking students for correspondence they wrote and sent to the soldiers while the soldiers were on active duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. This also helps date the text, since although the book was published in 2015, the Iraq War officially ended in 2011, so this text is being used well past the date of its original relevance. I suspect it may have been recycled from a reading passage written much earlier than the book was published. We may well ask why US schoolchildren would be writing letters to US soldiers on active duty overseas, especially soldiers involved in conflicts of highly contested legal and ethical legitimacy. Who introduced them to this idea? And why did their teachers consent? Did their parents consent? The passage continues. Quote, keep the cards and letters coming, Sergeant Alan Len told students who have been writing all year long. We read some of the cards you guys wrote over and over again. Some of the soldiers don't get any mail, so your letters mean a lot to them. The soldiers even hang the cards around their doors, so the inspirational greetings are the last things they see as they head off to work in Iraq. End quote. Now we discover that the students were writing encouraging messages to the overseas US soldiers, who apparently greatly appreciated their support. The fact that the students were writing these supportive letters indicates that they were told the US soldiers were doing the right thing and were worthy of encouragement. The language the text uses to describe the soldiers is noteworthy. It not only calls the students' letters inspirational, reinforcing their importance, but also uses the phrase, quote, head off to work in Iraq, end quote, to describe the actions of the US soldiers. When we remember that these US soldiers in Iraq are actually in the country specifically to kill, and that tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians were murdered by direct US military actions, and hundreds of thousands more died indirectly from the same actions, then the phrase off to work should be particularly repugnant. This is the euphemistic language of propaganda, not only concealing the hideous truth from the students who would read this text, but also normalizing and legitimizing the concept of US soldiers going to war overseas, depicting it as nothing more than people going off to work. The text continues, quote, in Shelby County, Alabama, students welcomed Sergeant Demir Lyko to their school. They had written letters to Lyko's army unit in Afghanistan. The letters mean the world to us, Lyko said. We sit around our table, all of us reading. The letters put smiles on my troops' faces. End quote. This language is clearly intended to depict these letters as positive, wholesome, and a welcome encouragement to US soldiers. Readers are being conditioned to regard the letters as entirely appropriate and highly valuable. Remember, this book has been read by countless thousands of students over the last 7 years, all of them being exposed to US war propaganda in the form of English teaching material. The text continues, quote, Lyko presented the students with an American flag that flew in Afghanistan. He hoped the students see this flag as something special. This is the greatest country in the world, and that flag represents this country and freedom, Lyko told a news reporter. End quote. This is completely undisguised nationalism in the service of war propaganda. The issue here is not simply that the students described in the text were being conditioned to believe that their country is the greatest in the world and that their flag represents freedom, though this is repulsive enough. It's also that the student readers of this book are likewise being conditioned to have the same view of the United States and to wrongly associate its flag with freedom. The text continues, quote, Fourth graders in York, Pennsylvania have been writing letters to soldiers in Afghanistan. Last month, Sergeant Keith Lloyd stopped by to thank the students for their letters. We're over there doing what we have to do to get the mission done. It's a good break in the evening to sit down and read a letter, he said. End quote. It's worth noting that the text unashamedly tells us that US soldiers were encouraging impressionable fourth graders to support an illegal war overseas in which the US military were murdering civilians and representing that war as both legitimate and noble. The language used by this officer is explicitly propagandistic. Sergeant Lloyd says, quote, We're over there doing what we have to do to get the mission done, end quote, reinforcing the idea that the US soldiers are nobly carrying out an honorable duty. His words, quote, It's a good break in the evening to sit down and read a letter, end quote, give the impression that the letter-reading soldiers are enjoying a well-earned rest after a regular day at work. There's no hint of the real violence in which they are engaged. The text finishes with these two sentences, quote, Sergeant Ryan Schmidt recently paid a visit to second graders at a school in St. Asgar, Iowa. He thanked students for the letters they wrote while he was in Iraq. Getting letters from students brings a little bit of happiness to the day, he said. Schmidt is about to return to Iraq for another tour of duty. Many students have pinned yellow ribbons to their backpacks as a way to remember him until he comes home again. End quote. This tells us that the US military has been sending army officers to indoctrinate 7-year-old children into supporting the army, brainwashing them into believing US involvement in overseas conflicts is justified and legitimate. The entire article completely normalizes the US military's international warmongering and impresses it onto emotionally and intellectually vulnerable young minds. How did US soldiers respond to these letters? I think it's worth considering how US soldiers at the time felt about these letters. The responses I found on the Quora website range from the completely predictable to the highly surprising. It would be a useful exercise to share some of these with school children rather than indoctrinating them with military propaganda. One soldier, Brian Cheney, is highly enthusiastic, writing, quote, "We would open them all and find the funniest one, the kindest one, the heartbreaking one, etc., and read them aloud," end quote. However, he provides a more interesting insight when he writes, quote, "There were a couple that had some anti-military language," end quote, adding, quote, "One kid asked us how it felt to kill children for a country that hates minorities," end quote. Clearly, some of the children involved in the letter writing were well informed and immune to mental conditioning. Unfortunately, this didn't appear to have a significant effect on Cheney's own perspective. He writes of keeping the more favourable letters for use as personal encouragement, saying, quote, "Any time I begin to lose faith in my country or start to reach a dark place, I take them out and remember the good times that those letters spawned and why we do what we do," end quote. He ends his comment with the unfortunately depressing words, quote, "Kind of a long answer, but the moral of the story is that we love them, and please, if you are a teacher reading this, please keep this tradition going," end quote. I don't think that's actually the moral of this story. Another soldier, Philip John Bliss, offers a very different perspective, writing, quote, "I saw a lot of soldiers toss stacks of kid mail into the trash without even looking at it," end quote, and adding, quote, "Likely, if there were one or two letters in a package, they at least got looked at," end quote. Bliss acknowledges, quote, "There may be a few different opinions out there," end quote, but insists, quote, "Most stacks of cards got tossed, usually after a few were glanced at," end quote. Another soldier, Alexander Rodriguez, writes, quote, "Despite some saying they didn't or that letters were thrown away in stacks, those were clearly the actions of a very few and in no way the norm," end quote. Shedding valuable light on the attitude of the US military, he explains, quote, "The military has learned from past lessons that we must cultivate and maintain good relationship with the general public. Our future pool of military personnel depends on it, and when the public support turns against a cause, well, look what happened in Vietnam and Korea," end quote. This demonstrates very clearly that the aim of this ethically offensive exercise is explicitly to cultivate a closer emotional connection between the public and the US military, ensuring both public support for US military intervention overseas and a reliable supply of what Rodriguez calls, quote, "our future pool of military personnel," end quote. Another soldier, John Vanatta, comments shortly, quote, "We get a real laugh out of some of them, usually for the wrong reasons," end quote. A longer, more detailed, and considerably more serious answer is given by another soldier, Virgil Huston, who writes, quote, "There were some that made me sad and made me wonder what some schools, especially church schools, were teaching their kids, as some were pretty bloodthirsty. That was not cool coming from an elementary school kid writing in crayon or pencil with crayon drawings," end quote. Huston continues, quote, "Overall, the letters were sweet, but not very meaningful," end quote, adding that he responded to a few, but since he never received any replies, he, quote, "stopped paying attention after a while," end quote. Huston's remaining commentary is worth quoting at length. He writes, quote, "The bottom line is that thinking about what some of these kids were taught and how their brains considered war, what to them was an abstraction, was unnerving. They were the next generation of cannon fodder. Iraq made me more anti-war than I already was, and I was pretty anti-war. LOL. Some of these kids were getting brainwashed," end quote. Hopefully, these insights of his resulted in a change of Huston's professional career at the earliest available opportunity. Finally, another soldier, Victor Philippi, provides an equally valuable perspective, opening his response with, quote, "Me personally, I didn't like it at all," end quote. Philippi's explanation of his position reveals a man deeply conflicted. He explains, quote, "Frankly, I never knew what to say or how to respond to letters from children," end quote, adding, quote, "I couldn't tell them about how much I hated the war and the things I was doing," end quote. More terrible still, he continues, quote, "Surely I couldn't tell them about some of the messes I had to deal with, like the time a group of gunmen showed up to a kid's soccer game and murdered them all in cold blood," end quote. He leaves unexplained exactly who these gunmen were. Philippi's additional commentary shows he was strongly affected by his experiences. We are not obligated to feel sympathy for him, and indeed, outrage and disgust would be more appropriate emotional responses. At some point in his life, for whatever reasons, he himself made the decisions which led to his involvement in an illegal war which cost the lives of well over 100,000 people at the lowest estimate. That is his responsibility, and we don't have to feel sorry for him. Nevertheless, it's interesting to consider his remaining words. He writes, quote, "Losing soldiers under my command and dealing with dead and dying combatants and civilians alike was reality I faced. What do I tell a bunch of kids about that? In the middle of my time in Iraq, I stopped caring about making it out of Iraq alive. I saw lots of death up close, and in many of those instances, I didn't want to die like they did. Also, I didn't feel like I had anything to return to," end quote. His next words provide some hope that he at least learned something from the consequences of his earlier decisions. He writes, quote, "Do I tell kids about those sorts of struggles, where suicide started to seem like a reasonable solution? After a grueling day of killing and combat patrols, do I tell the kids about how hollow I felt inside? I personally didn't feel any sense of pride or glory or patriotism when I was stuffing body bags. How am I supposed to take words like, 'Thank you for your service'?" End quote. Philippi ends his comments by saying that the children's letters, quote, "didn't help my morale at all," end quote, and, quote, "only highlighted to me the increasing disconnect between me and civilians," end quote. If you're an educator in a position to talk to children about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this, I suggest, is far more appropriate material to expose them to, with, of course, appropriate wording, context, and preparation. This is what they should really be hearing. Conclusion. This book was originally published at least as early as 2011 and has been republished several times since, at least as recently as 2016. It is certain that during that time, hundreds of thousands of students have been exposed to its content, if not millions. It is rather ironic that this book was written by two Chinese authors, published in Beijing, and marketed mainly to the Southeast Asian market. It is especially ironic that this textbook has also been printed and used in Vietnam since 2015, given that country's horrific historical encounter with the US military. This content is completely inappropriate for an English language teaching textbook. It is particularly insidious because it introduces pro-US military propaganda to a susceptible, non-native English-speaking audience, in particular, in the case of Taiwan, an audience which is likely to be less knowledgeable about the facts concerning US military operations around the world, and which is already encouraged by the Taiwan government to see the US as an ally and force for good. Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons, Elias Asvig, Alexander Curzon, Shawnee Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Niels Rethlin, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, Emily Kugler, A. David Johnson, B the Heretic, Sean M, Waymore Odhi, Aubrey Vaughan, and Magic Turtle. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.